All right, I will go ahead and get started. So thanks for that introduction. I'm Lily from Recidiviz. I am a tech lead manager at Recidiviz. I've been here for about a year and a half. And yeah, I'll be giving a short-ish overview of the organization, then I'll pause for some Q&A if there's any, and then I will pass it over to Genevieve, who will go into a much more detailed technical dive. So if you have questions about that, you can save it for her. All right, so Recidiviz is a nonprofit organization with the mission of reducing incarceration across the country. We are a very tech-focused nonprofit. About half of our employees are engineers. And the very high-level way in which we work is that we partner with state corrections agencies. We ingest their data, and then we use that data to run analyses and build tools and products that influence their policy, practices, and behaviors in a reform-minded and decarceral way. Recidiviz was founded about 4 years ago. Currently, we have a team of over 60 people. We grew a lot during COVID and then even more since COVID. We're a very remote organization spread out all across the country, but with small offices in both Oakland and New York City. And we are currently partnered with corrections agencies in 11 states, which account for over a fourth of the US prison population. And we are always working on expanding that number and forming partnerships with more and more states. So what's really great about our working model is that it is nonpartisan. We partner with both red and blue states. And there are several reasons why states all across the spectrum sign up to work with us, and especially why they do so right now. So one is staffing shortages. Corrections agencies are having a lot of trouble hiring people currently. So a lot of agencies are looking to safely reduce their prison populations to a size that can be effectively managed by a smaller number of staff while they attempt to kind of hire and fill for those vacant positions. Another is that we're currently in a tough climate for criminal justice reform legislation. There's a real popularity of the tough on crime narrative these days. And so states that might have previously focused on getting new policies passed to effect change now have to seek other alternatives. And the way we work, our process doesn't require new legislation. Instead, what we do is ensure that we're making the most of existing legislation and really like maximizing out the change that we can effect under those policies. So what is our process exactly? There are 3 main components, and I will go into these more in detail shortly. But at a very high level, the first part is identifying people who are stuck in the system, people maybe who are eligible for release entirely or who are eligible for a lower level of custody or supervision, and then helping them get unstuck and moved through. Another is identifying staff and officers who have demonstrated overly carceral behavior and working to shift their behavior to in a more reform-minded way. And then lastly, holding agencies accountable to their data and their results by making all of that public and being able to track trends and changes over time. One thing to clarify before moving forward is that currently, as might have been clear from the previous slides, we focus our work on what we call the back half of the criminal justice system. So that's namely prisons and community supervision, so people who are on parole or probation after getting out of prison. And there are definitely levers to be pulled earlier on in the system, like reducing the number of people who get arrested or sentenced to prison in the first place. And we hope to expand into these areas in the future, but are not currently doing as much in there. So you hear me talking a lot about prison and community supervision, that's because that's really what our bread and butter is right now. Okay, so now I'm going to dive in a little more detail into that 3-step process I mentioned. Oops. So this first component is identifying people who are succeeding, but who are stuck. So this might be someone who is eligible for release from prison, but their officer hasn't had the time to fill out the paperwork to get them released, which is a shockingly common occurrence. And I think was one of the most surprising things to me when I joined Recidivists is that this is even a thing, that someone could be in prison for way longer than they have to, just because they don't maybe even know that they're eligible and their officer is overworked and they're just kind of lingering there. Or it might mean someone who maybe isn't eligible for a full release, but is eligible for, like I said, a lower level of custody or supervision that would require, that would make their life a little bit easier and get them closer to liberty. So we use our data to find these people, and then we surface these people to the officers and staff who can actually take the right actions. And even more than that, we try to automate as much of the process as possible. So this can mean actually going ahead and filling out the forms and the paperwork for that overworked officer so that they don't have to do, they have to do as little as possible. All they have to do is press a button and the paperwork is sent off to the right person and the person is moved out of the system. Because basically, a lot of these staff and officers are, like I said, really overworked. There are major staffing shortages and they're not incentivized to get people moved out of the system as quickly as possible. But if we make it really easy for them, they will. It also might mean highlighting people who are not yet eligible for release or for an opportunity, but who are almost eligible. And they just need a pointer to a few remaining steps they can take, a program they need to enroll in, a test they need to pass, a certain number of days they need to go without a certain violation, et cetera. And so we can surface these things that they still need to do and create a checklist for them and their parole or probation officer or staff officer to work through together. So these are a lot of the web and product tools that we build are basically for this first component, which is getting people out of the system, identifying them, surfacing them, automating the steps to get them moved out. The second component is a little more heavy on the data analysis side. And this is to look at people, the staff and the officers who are meeting with the incarcerated individuals or individuals on supervision and are making the decisions that control how quickly these folks move through the system. These officers have a lot of power. And we've found from looking at the data that some are way more punitive and carceral than others. However, with intervention, having conversations with them, surfacing this to them, they might not even know that's the case because they're not talking to their peers and getting a sense of, how everyone else is calibrating, right? So by talking to them, they might realize, oh, I didn't know that I was being a little more harsh than I should be, or that my peers are, and we can really shift their behavior. And finally, the third component is to create accountability. And this is by, once we've done a lot of this work to affect change, we want to make that change stick. We want to make sure that, even when recidivist lessens our involvement with a state or with an agency, they continue to keep up the work that we've set them up for. And so one way to do this is to have them, to make as much of their data and results public so that advocates and policymakers and practitioners can see the trends, can see the data, can see the story over time of which states, which agencies are having which results, which policies, which practices are working, which ones aren't working, and then can kind of put pressure on states and agencies to change or to say, hey, this was really working super well in Arkansas, maybe you should try it in Nebraska or so forth. So the Justice Counts and the Spotlight projects mentioned on this slide both work. Their mission is to make data accessible to the public. The Spark project mentioned here is a little bit different. What that project does is to use the public data that we collect to actually create memos that advocate for or against certain legislation that is up to be passed. And so we kind of, to go a step further, we take this public data and we use it to model the effect that we think a certain piece of legislation is going to have on the prison population, on disparities, on equity in the future. And so we use some machine learning and modeling here to make those predictions, and then to bring it bring it to policymakers to help them make their decision with the legislation. Okay, so how do we accomplish all of this? I mean, I mentioned this earlier. We partner with states. So our kind of business model or working model is that our client is the state, and so we go and form partnerships with states. They enter into data sharing agreements with us where they agree to send us their the individual person level data on everybody in the system in that state, you know, their names, where they currently are, what their release date is, what, you know, just, huge amounts of data, which Genevieve will get into soon. And then in return, we offer them data science and product services. So we do analyses for them, we build products for them, we build tools for them, and so we sort of act in this kind of reciprocal way. So yeah, so like I said, we're getting in huge amounts of case level data coming in every day from these states. And of course, or maybe not of course, but what is very true is that every state deals with different data in different formats, right? There isn't like a countrywide, you know, standard for this is how you handle your case level data. Every state has a different schema, different types of data they collect, different names for those columns, you know, you name it, it's different. And so what our data platform does is automatically ingest this raw data, normalize it, convert it to a common schema, and then use it to power the analyses and tools and products that we build, so that we're able to just build a tool once, right? You know, a single piece of code for a tool and have it work across all of the states we partner with kind of magically, because our platform has done that standardization and normalization. And I will not talk any more about this because I don't really know how it works because I don't work in this part of the organization, and Genevieve is the expert and she will go into much more depth very soon. But that's the segue to her part. Before that, any questions on the high-level overview of recidivism? Happy to answer anything.
Yeah.
Lily,
oh, go ahead.
Go ahead. My first question was, after you finish with the prison population, are you going to be able to, or has anybody proposed tackling the jail population? There's been a recent ruling by a fairly high-level judge, I think it was California, that said, yeah, if you haven't brought somebody in front of a judge or magistrate within 10 days, you got to let them go. It could have been a different state, but there's a lot of people languishing in jail awaiting for just a hearing, and just wondered if that was going to be in recidivism's future.
Absolutely, that's a great question. You know, I'm not 100% sure of the answer. I think part of the reason we haven't, I mean, I'm sure we would love to, and I think it almost certainly is on a roadmap. I think part of what makes that challenging is unlike, and Jennifer, I see you came on video, so if you have something to add to this, but I think unlike corrections, jail data is often not as centralized in a state, and like it's more local. So that's like jail data is often handled by the law enforcement agencies in a city or in a county. So it's not as simple as partnering with this, you know, the corrections agency and getting all that data in one fell swoop. It would require forming relationships with all of these different law enforcement agencies, and they might all be formatting their data differently. So it kind of exponentially increases the problem of doing that standardization. Genevieve, I'll let you chime in if you have anything else.
No, that's perfect. I was just going to say pretty much the same thing. I think nothing's really off the table in terms of what we are interested in doing, especially as it could have increasingly important impact. But we are a little bit at the mercy of what we actually can get data on. And so I think over time, we're increasingly interested in identifying partnerships with states that are specifically interested in addressing jail populations, et cetera. Up to this point, we haven't necessarily focused on it, but it is certainly an interesting opportunity in the future.
Somebody else had a question?
Yes, I had a question. So I did notice that, and maybe I just missed this, but it didn't look like North Carolina was on that list of states. As far as sort of the process involved in onboarding a state, is that something that will be covered later in this talk? Or so I guess if we're going to talk about North Carolina specifically, is that an issue of getting our hands on the data, what is the specific limitation in, you know, the example of North Carolina that would prevent you all from being able to add them to your list?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I don't think that will be covered later on. I think I don't have a ton of insight into exactly the process of partnering with a new state. We have staff at Recidiviz whose entire job is to form relationships with people in different states and negotiate with them about what a partnership might look like. And some states are really excited and eager to sign up right away. Others have hesitations for one reason or another. I mean, it costs money to partner with us, right? So it's not something that we don't provide the services for free, even though we often do subsidize them with other grants and funding so that we can make it as cheap as possible for states. And we try to make it so that very little work is required on the state's part. Really, it's pretty simple to set up that data pipeline where you start sending the data to us. But yeah, there's negotiation and agreement to be had in terms of whether the partnership is right for the state, whether we can provide services that they're looking for to make it worth their time. You know, sometimes certain states have really technically sophisticated departments already that are like, we do all of our data analysis in-house and we don't need, you know, any more tools, but thank you, right? So it kind of depends. And I don't know about North Carolina's position in particular, but.
Thank you. Yeah. Sorry, can I ask one more question? Very quick question. So I was also curious because, and I know this is kind of a tough subject and maybe you all don't necessarily want to address this over the video, but maybe offline, but you know, I know that some states, you know, have the death penalty. Is that something, is that maybe an area that you all have looked into as far as, you know, using the data for, you know, a positive goal in that space with the states that you are partnered with?
Yeah, that's a great question. Probably where that would have come up, and I'm not sure if it has, but would have been with the Spark policy memos I mentioned.
Yes, that's what I thought about. Yeah.
Yeah, it's not something we probably bring up with like states as part of our normal partnerships. I think with those partnerships, we try to be, like I said, kind of a little bit more nonpartisan and meet them where they're at. But with our Spark policy memos, I think we have tended to take more of a stance on certain issues. I know we've done legislation regarding like marijuana legalization and stuff like that. I don't off the top of my head know if we've had one on death penalty. I wouldn't be surprised if we had, but it kind of depends on, you know, what legislation is up at what time and what data we have and whether we can make whether we can model something that we think would make a compelling case and whether we think we have a chance of, you know, so there's a lot of factors in terms of what we do or do not choose to do. Yeah.
Sure. Yeah. And that would make sense too, especially from like the data perspective, because, you know, it's my understanding as far as the death penalty specifically, you know, the overall cost associated with, you know, putting someone on death row and then carrying out that whole process. You know, the extent to which all of that is being captured and updated and maintained, you know, I'm sure that's, you know, wildly variable from state to state. So, so yeah, thank you. Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Oh, okay. I had muted myself. Have you run up against the automated sentencing software that judges use?
Ooh, maybe. So we're actually just beginning to branch out into sentencing. Like I mentioned, you know, we've mostly been focusing on the back half of the pipeline, so it's after someone's already in prison. We're spinning up a work stream, like I think literally today someone joined to lead that team. So I think I know a little bit about this, but maybe not a ton. It's quite possible you know a lot more than me.
Too early. Okay. I wanted to tell everyone that I had invited the Wilson Center. This is a Duke law school, law and science. That's it. The Wilson Center at Duke is a law and science organization to give a presentation about the work that they did. Would probably not be very technical, but certainly would meet the theme of we've got a big problem in America. What can we do about it?
The one thing I would
But
add to that is, oh, sorry.
But they didn't have it. They couldn't come up with a speaker.
Yeah, it's to your point, very much lots of discussion going on, and there's ongoing efforts to do that. We have done various state-specific analyses around their sentencing policy, so length of stay analysis and things of that nature. Truth in sentencing, we've done some analyses on. So all that to say that it is certainly something that we are interested in, and I guess broadly, sorry, there's a very loud fire truck going by. I don't know if you can hear it. Broadly, we're interested in any sort of opportunity that can highlight certain discrepancies or certain ways in which policies are not actually serving the population. We are a decarceral organization, so we are interested in things like that, but it is ultimately something that I think we are excited about the future opportunities to develop in partnership with others, as well as within, internally sentencing calculators, understanding length of stay, things like that. So very much an exciting new frontier that we're excited to get into.
Mark, I wanted to let you know your mic is picking up some sort of metallic clicking noise, and it's coming through.
Sorry. It's a fidget thing. Sorry.
That's what.
I'll take my hand away from the little metal thing that I'm fidgeting with. A binder clip.
Well, if there aren't any other questions, should we turn over to Genevieve in the second half of the show?
Well, let me at least show up.
For sure. Thanks, Mark.
Okay. This it appears Genevieve's got her hair pulled back all the way, so she is going to look a little different. But Genevieve, now that we've heard about the who of recidivism and their mission statement, the how of recidivism is Genevieve, and I'm going to give it a shot. First ever Hyde Camp. Did I get that right?
Correct.
Hyde Camp. Yay!
Give me a second.
And I did not take German in school. So,
well done. All right, can you all see my screen?
Stop sharing. No, I got to stop sharing first. Hang on.
I can see your screen, Genevieve. Looks good.
My screen. So say from state data to recidivist products. A very overarching, hopefully inspiring message for you all. So yes, today Lily did an amazing job of kind of talking about what we try to do at Recidiviz, and a very natural question that we get asked very often, and I actually don't know specifically all of your backgrounds, but especially if someone has worked in the government or with government agencies, government data is interesting to work with, to say the least. And so a huge portion of our work and the development of our data platform, man, it's another siren. Hopefully they'll be gone soon. Apologies. So a huge part of our work is how do we identify the data that we need within state databases and then get it into the recidivist system, clean it, do a bunch of things with it so that we can fuel products and analyses and things like that. So this is the highest level of a visualization of what we try to do. When we talk about state data, we're talking about typically, I mean, some of these are mainframes from the 1980s, 200 different tables with many different pieces of information. And one of the really important things that Lily pointed out previously was that, for example, there could be one policy that's early discharge, and there's 10 requirements that someone has to meet for that, but that lives in 10 different tables in 10 different places in the state data system. And so currently one of the big issues is that a parole officer is going to have to check 10 different places in order to fill out a form to then get that person early discharged. So as you can imagine, that takes a really long time. And so our goal is to create a standardized data layer that then makes all of that chaotic, many different threads of many different things into 4 beautifully straight curved lines, which honestly, even then, sometimes it's not, but we do try our best to clean it up as much as possible. This somewhat confusing diagram is one of the ones that Lily showed at the end, is in the highest level version, what we mean when we refer to the data platform at Recidivist. So we import the data from the state, we ingest it, which ingest is what I'm really going to go into more detail on, of like, what do we mean when we say ingest? And then once that data is cleaned and in a much prettier state agnostic format, we then use that data to calculate things like count of admission metrics on certain days, things like most severe violation types over a certain amount of time. And then all of that analysis and count, et cetera, will be fueled and exported out to various different products and analyses that we've talked about up to this point. So specifically the platforms that we're using, again, I mentioned kind of import, ingest, calculate. We use Google Cloud Services for almost everything, with a few exceptions. And so the ingest process happens within, our raw data gets dropped into Google Cloud Services storage. Then we put it into BigQuery. BigQuery is where we do a bunch of our analyses. And then eventually into Dataflow is where we actually calculate all of these various different things. So we'll calculate things like admissions. We'll calculate things like incarceration starts, incarceration finishes, things of that nature. One caveat to all of this is, at any point, you probably could be thinking like, you're saying a lot of acronyms or confusing things, which I have tried to make it as not vocab specific as possible, but some specific definitions that are helpful. When I refer to raw data, that means the files that we receive from states. So states will send us read-only CSV versions of the data that lives in their system. That is the raw data, which we then use within all of our pipelines. GCP, GCS, BigQuery, Dataflow are all Google platforms that we use to actually do all of the processing that we do. And then schema, which I will go specifically into what our schema looks like, is essentially the state agnostic version of how we envision criminal justice data. And the goal is to take raw data, do transformation on it to hydrate our schema in a state agnostic way that says across any person that we've received information on in the criminal justice system, no matter what state they're from, we could give you a list of all of the various periods of incarceration that they've gone under. So when they started incarceration at first, all of the important status movements during that time, and then when they were eventually released, for example. So ingest, what do we mean by that? What are we actually saying? Ingest translates to basically hydrating our schema, our state agnostic schema of how we visualize criminal justice data. And this is the official definition of it. We at first obviously start with no data. We talked a little bit about, like, how does our partnership start with the state? We do basically we are at the control of whether a state is willing to work with us and is willing to send us data or not. And so there's a whole slew of work related to business development that I am not at all the right person to talk to you about that. I do know that we are always interested in partnering with new states. So if in North Carolina, for specifically, you have a contact with the Department of Corrections, do let us know, because we are always happy to have the chance to open up new potential interactions. But the partner states we have currently are states that have signed with us, that have signed a DSA with us, that are willing to send us their data to then fuel analyses and products for them. So we don't have their data at first. They then send us the raw data, and then we try to convert that into recidivist data. Now, one important thing to call out is before ingest can actually begin, we figure out who to talk to in the state, and we need to basically identify which part of the system they're most interested in beginning with. Some states say we need a lot of help with our supervision data or supervision systems, and others will say actually our incarceration population is more of an issue. So that will kind of direct which data we ask for first. We'll plan out kind of the first couple things that we're going to work on with them. And then that's really when I, as an implementation engineer, come in, and I will have to interact with the whatever version of state IT department exists in the state, and say, okay, the Department of Corrections is looking for all the supervision movements for people that have been under supervision in the state, and someone in the state IT department will tell me, okay, that lives in these 4 tables, and I'll say, great. Can you send me those tables? Can you give me a data dictionary for those tables? And can we make sure that the DSA is signed so that we have a contract and they're ready to start sending us data? Now, that is a long process. In one slide, I've just summarized what usually takes months of time because there's many discussions to be had along all of those things. But once we have confirmed that a state is interested in working with us and is going to send us data, we ask them to do one of 2 things. We need to receive the data in an automated way. It's really important for fueling our analyses, keeping them up to date, making sure that we could create an analysis, but if that data is months old, they could come to us and say, oh, the 10 people that you identified that were eligible for this opportunity are no longer eligible, which really defeats the purpose of us doing the analysis. So we do require in some capacity to receive automated data. There's 2 ways they can do that. They can either push the data directly to us into a Google Cloud storage bucket, and we can set them up with credentials to do that. Or they have an SFTP site that they will upload the CSV files to, and then we can pull the data. We have our platform has an automated way that we can look for files anytime they're new, pull them down into our Google system, and then fuel the rest of the pipelines. So, excuse me, the steps of ingest. Assuming we are starting this journey saying, okay, the state has already agreed to send us data, they are ready to push the data into the Google service bucket, or it's going to be an SFTP, we're ready to get it. Now let's actually do something with that data. We are going to try to ingest that data, make it as clean and beautiful as possible so that our data analysts, our product team, everyone that works with the data downstream can do so much more cleanly and with as little headache as possible. As you can imagine, there are times when the way that a state thinks about certain data doesn't really fit with our state agnostic schema, but we have ways to adapt to that, which I'll go into. So the first step is the import step. We get those raw data files from the state. They send us first an initial historical dump. So they'll send us every single piece of information they have from all time. With most states, they'll tell you, okay, you can trust data after January 1st, 1995. But all of the data before that might be an issue because we changed our data system in 1994 or because this changed, etc. And so there's usually some sort of cutoff, but we do ask for any data they have because it does help us create a full picture of the supervision or incarceration systems in the state. And transparently, there are people that are still incarcerated on supervision today that were also incarcerated or on supervision in 1995. So it's very important to us that we do have as much of that data as possible. We also will ask for validation data from the state. How do you know what your incarceration population is, for example? And so we can confirm that. And it is really a siren-filled day in my neighborhood. I apologize. And so they start sending us that data, and we will configure our data with YAML files and with specific encoding and separators to basically know that we're going to receive the data in the same way every time. We do ask states to pick the same encoding, to pick a separator that's not going to be used in those CSV files. We can basically hard code any sort of decision they make. So if they're like, oh, we have to send it to you with a double dagger delimiter, great. We'll just put it into our system. We can handle many different encodings, many different separators. The goal is basically to make it as easy as possible for them to send us their data so that they are pleased and excited to work with us. They're like, man, recidivists, we can send it to them in this format and they can use it, and they're delighted to answer all of our questions. Because after we receive these CSV tables is when the real work of ingest begins. So before I get into exactly the platform and how we use that, I want to describe a little bit what we mean when we say state schema. So our schema is our state agnostic view of criminal justice data. That starts with the key entity being the state person. So that will include information on someone's name, their identification number within the state, so their DOC number, birthday, gender, race, ethnicity, email address, phone number, current address if we have it. And then we start to build and connect for that person various different components of different entities that relate to that person. So, for example, we have a state person entity in our schema. We also have a state incarceration period within our schema. That state incarceration period, the single unit of it, is a single period of incarceration. So it would be someone served some type of incarceration in this place under this custody level from this date to this date, and here's why. That is like one single unit. What we can then do is we can build those incarceration periods up over time. So for one person, we can connect in our schema all of the different incarceration periods they've ever experienced. So in this case, we have a person that had a single type of incarceration from 2001 to 2010. And then from 2010 to 2012, they were on supervision. And then in 2019 to now, they are incarcerated again. So we have incarceration periods, we have supervision periods. We do have sentence entities within our schema, so we can connect to a state person. We can say, these are the incarceration sentences they've received, these are the supervision sentences they've received, so on and so forth. The goal being that we are able to essentially paint a picture within our schema of all of the things that have happened to someone during their time with the Department of Corrections. So for this person in particular, during the supervision period, perhaps they had some supervision violations, perhaps they were supervised by the specific parole officer. Our schema will know that. We also will be able to tell you all of this was related to a single specific sentence from 2001 maybe, or something else, who knows, but the goal being we ingest all of this separately and then we stitch it together at the end after we've cleaned it and confirmed that it does match what the state thinks is true for this person.
Genevieve?
Yes.
Will you take questions during your presentation, or do we have to wait till afterwards?
I can take questions during. I can't see the chat unless I pop it up. Let's see.
Well, not a problem. When you got to the what you received in raw data from the state, I have encountered data from Texas, not prison data, that it wasn't delimited. It was the data dictionary was a COBOL 77 section with overlays, and this field repeats in times, and it's a big mess. And I'm wondering if you run into a state where it's almost purposefully not friendly to share or acquire data. The data is the way the state has it, and if you want to use it, well, you have to jump through all of the hoops to do the processing, because they're not going to delimit it for you, that kind of thing. Have you run into that? Not necessarily in Texas, but that was what comes to mind from previous experience.
Yeah, it's a great question. We are willing to work with the state within reason. And I think a lot of what I'm going through here and our ability to import, transform, and then put it into our analyses is based on the fact that we know states do not have the resources or time to make things as pretty as possible for us. So we certainly have had interesting situations where a state will say, the way we think about our data is like this. And so we're going to send it to you like this. And then you have to figure out how to make that into periods, for example. That does happen very often. If a state is unwilling, excuse me, to send us delimited CSVs, it does very much limit our ability to do any work. If they pretty much were like, no, we're not going to send you our data. Well, that's a choice that they're making that we can't really, if they're not willing to send us the data in some format that we can interpret, then we can't really do much with it. One of the reasons we do have the flexibility on what type of encoding is used or what separator is used is the fact that we do want it to be as simple as possible for them to send. And so we also, I will say, sometimes people ask oh, well, does the state create a view of their database that they send to you? We actually request them not to do that. We specifically say, do not send us a view of your data, send us the raw table exactly as it is, because when they build on logic of the views, there's sometimes things that we don't realize that they're doing, that then when we start analyzing it, there's things missing, etc. So we do try to ask for the most simplistic version of send us the base raw data that we can use to understand state person, incarceration movements, etc. But that it has its bounds. And the fact that if a state literally said, well, we won't send you CSVs at all, then I don't know how we would work with them. Or we've had to get creative, I think, on, you know, perhaps if they said, we'll send you CSVs, but it's some kind of crazy something, we might be willing to work with it or be able to use it within our systems. But there is constantly a question of the amount of resources it would take for us to build a state-specific solution for interpreting certain data that, depending on how much they're paying us to do that, would influence how many engineering resources we could actually provide to create the engine that would ingest their data differently than how we get it from the rest of the states. But transparently, we, aside from, you know, some intricacies around what delimiter or encoding, or we're going to send it to you on this schedule, not this schedule, states typically do not have an issue sending us read-only versions of their CSVs. That's not been something that they've said, there's no way we can do that. And so until we have to figure out a way that that is not the method we get that, we probably will not adjust it. But, you know, if all of a sudden the next, 38 states that want to work with us tell us we refuse to do this, then we'd be forced to kind of think of something differently. I am looking at the chat now. Is there any third-party data? So there is third-party data, but we receive the third-party data from the state. So our DSA is with the state. So the state, excuse me, the state will send us tables within their data warehouse, or, you know, wherever they keep it. But some of their data, for example, like assessments, for example, is much more often collected via a third party. The state actually receives that data from the third party, who will, upload it, ingest it to their warehouse, and then they will have that table in theirs, and then that is the table they send to us. So it's always through the state because we have the agreement with the state to receive the data. Okay, I think that's all. If at any point you want to ask me questions, do let me know. I'm happy to answer as we go. Okay, so we've received data from the state, and then this is where, to, you know, an amazing point that's brought up is like, what if the state sends you data and it's not formatted how we expect? The short answer is it will not be formatted how we expect. Every state does this differently. Every state thinks of movements or tables, etc., very differently. And so what we do is we build out ingest views, which are SQL queries that pull in the data from any number of tables that the state has sent us, and then output how we anticipate a raw data field to map into our schema as well as it can be mapped. And so, for example, I said, you know, for state person, there will be an entity for, or there will be a field for full name. And so we will select from the table that we think has that information in using SQL, the first name, last name, birth date, and then, or whatever that is, and then we will actually output it as a table from that SQL query. Sometimes our SQL queries, our ingest views, are very simple. Sometimes they are very, very, very complex. They can be very heavy depending on what we have to do, how we have to join the data, how many tables need to be joined. In particular, for incarceration periods or supervision periods, those views tend to be very, very complex. You're joining 7 to 10 different raw data tables to understand custody level, facility, admission reason, release reason, state authority, many different things. So some capacity of being able to discern the easiest way is necessary, but sometimes it is truly just a very gnarly query that we have to join tables together. Once we have the output from that ingest view, that SQL query, we then have essentially a list of columns that we have. These are the outputs. You'll see these input columns. Those are the outputs of the ingest view query. And then those input columns are what we use to actually map the field into the entity. So actually into our schema. And so we use YAML mappings. This is an example of a YAML mapping where here's all the input columns. These are the columns that we created with our ingest view. And then for state person external ID, we're going to use their client ID. For the birth date, we're using the birth date field from an ingest view query, etc. So this is basically saying we had all this raw data, it's very chaotic. We wrote a SQL query on top of it to make it cleaner. Then we're going to basically draw lines from each output of the SQL query into a specific part of our schema. And so this is going to hydrate the state person object with things like birth date, full name, gender, etc. Okay, now we've hydrated our schema for the, currently our example is we're using state person. We wrote a SQL query. We mapped that SQL query to where it should actually exist for all of our different entities. That process of the entities that exist actually exists in Postgres. It's through a process called extract and merge that we will basically say, when we first understood this person's name, it was this. If we get new data, we can add it in to that same table. And if it's the exact same, we don't have to update the entity. If something has changed, we can update the entity in place, which is great news because, as you can imagine, things change as data we receive from a state. Sometimes they send us the information like this, and then over time something changes or we get new data. And so we eventually have all of that data into what we call the state table. And then the state table is loaded into BigQuery, where in BigQuery, it can be used to funnel or to hydrate and funnel all of the downstream views. From state, there's one more thing we can do. So up to this point, the way we've been able to kind of wrangle the data is we had the raw data, we wrote a SQL query, perhaps we did a really complex SQL query where we hard-coded in some things when we saw edge cases, or we figured out a way to account for certain scenarios like this. But there are other things that occasionally require additional processing that frankly are just not easy to do in SQL, or we can't do them with only looking at a single entity. So one thing to account for is that when we are looking at an ingest view, we are only hydrating a single entity, but maybe someone's incarceration period is influenced by some information from their incarceration sentence or vice versa. And so we have one more piece in this ingest pipeline that we can use to compare entities for a single person and clean things up. And so that's called normalization. This happens in data flow. And basically all of the things that got loaded into state will go through the normalization pipelines to be cleaned or changed or adjusted. And then the output of that is normalized state. And the output is what's actually used to funnel all the different calculation metrics. A really common thing, for example, is perhaps we see someone, they have a violation, and we see that they have a violation. We ingest it into a supervision violation for them. But then we're like, okay, we actually realized that the type of this violation was a technical violation, but we only know that because of their incarceration period information. So we only know that because of the admission reason on the incarceration period was a technical violation. And so we didn't get that from the violations data. We can use normalization to combine those together to then, for the actual entity, change it so the violation type is a technical violation. Okay, obviously, this is a pretty heavy, kind of ridiculous process we go through. The highest level version of like, okay, what did I just tell you? What is all this stuff? Is basically for these 4 steps: import, transform, load, and normalize. Most of it actually lives in BigQuery. We use other platforms to help us with the process, but primarily if you were saying like, how did data move through our data pipeline? You would see in our BigQuery raw data tables. So for example, you'd see Missouri raw data tables that are imported. Then you would see Missouri ingest view results for certain ingest views like state person. If you went to the state data table, you could query that data table and see all of the results with a state code of Missouri that have information on the people in the data for Missouri. And then normalized state would be all of the data that existed in state cleaned up a little bit more in case there was something else that we were missing. So coming back to this kind of scary graph. Now we've actually gone through the process. As I mentioned, the import is how we're actually getting all of the data from the state, importing that raw data. Ingest is the ingest views, the mappings, the normalization. All of that is meant to essentially streamline the data, make it match with our schema, and then normalize it in some way so that it's as clean as possible. And that all of that data then funnels into this next step, which we call calculate. Now, we do not have enough time for me to go into the details of calculate. It is even more insane than what we just went through. But as I mentioned, excuse me, the entities, the data that comes from normalize will be used to count various different metrics. They'll be used to export them into tools. We also have a secondary system called sessions, and sessions essentially will help with understanding spans of time that someone said, like overall incarcerated or overall in supervision. All this to say, this portion of calculate that fuels our products and analysis is really what gets us from, okay, we were able to identify all of the data into a state to then actually generate metrics that are interesting and valuable and important for states to understand how that's working out. That is all the slides I have. I'm happy to answer any and all questions. The one final thing I will note is overall, the thing that we hear the most about from states, the thing that they're most excited about is this process of ingest that we have. The way that we have managed to create a platform that can do it in a state agnostic way. And we do have an entire team of engineers who are focused on basically creating all of this and funneling the data through this pipeline. But the way that we have done this has allowed for quite a bit of impact and also just understanding of the data that does not exist within states right now. Their ability to stitch together someone's entire overview of their time in the system is greatly aided by this sort of state schema overlooking view. And yeah, I'm happy to answer any questions.
Genevieve, this is Mark. I was wondering, you've told us about Postgres and BigQuery, and was wondering maybe what other databases might have been involved, if there's any graph databases, what languages you use to do some processing. Somebody takes the YAML files, ingests them and generates the queries based upon the YAML files, that kind of thing.
Yeah, so we primarily use SQL and Python. We really only use BigQuery, and then Postgres is only used for our extract and merge process between hydrate and load. So that's what allows us to essentially track how entities stay the same or change over time. But other than that, it is all loaded into Google Cloud Storage, which is then processed via data flow metrics. So data flow is our actual pipelines that tell us all the logic of how to combine all of this data and then output into data sets that are used to fuel all of that. We also have visualization tool. We use the Looker as a visualization tool. So if we wanted to kind of visualize all of this together, we can go to Looker and stitch together all the different data sets. But yeah, we primarily truly just use Google, and then Postgres is simply only currently for the extract and merge process.
I've had a comment in the chat, and there's a question about ETL versus ELT, and I said, well, you're missing an obvious third option, which is ETLT, which is you do part of the transformation during the ingestion process, but before the load process, and then you do other transformations after the load process. And I think what you're doing is a good illustration of that. Yeah,
definitely. This has, worth calling out. Like this, what is currently our ingest pipeline today has gone through a number of iterations, and it's specifically born out of, what you're mentioning, kind of the discussion around like what is actually most useful. How are we actually able to clean the data in the way that keeps everyone who's working on it sane enough, and also can do it in a way that is correct. We have had, to more or lesser extent, some states that work with us just say, great, you cleaned the data, incredible. But we also have had states that said, wait, this process that you're doing, can you let us know what things you have to account for in your transformation or normalization process? Because that's something that we would love to know that's like not being perhaps done correctly, or is, you know, an interesting way to do it. And so we've had states that are actually quite interested in, like, what are you doing to get to the point after normalization, and what actual logic are you applying? Because that is indicative to us of kind of like what is necessary for our data. So it has been iterated on, and this is currently the iteration because it by far and away gets us the best results over time. Any other questions?
Genevieve, I'm curious. I think one of the biggest challenges of creating a standardized view of data is that someone is going to have something that you didn't anticipate, and you'll find or think that it might be very valuable. Have you seen that happen? And do you have a way to kind of add in flexibility for whether it's just a flexible field where you can capture something new, or you maybe update your schemas over time?
Great question. We certainly update our schema. We have an entire process called schema change request that essentially means that as we learn more about how we interpret the data, how states interpret the data, you know, informs perhaps we need a new field here, or perhaps we need to change this, or perhaps we need to add certain enums to this. Like, all of that happens very much so, and it is very much like a live and living schema in that way. And it has gone through several, you know, major iterations or overhauls of, like, do we actually need this entity? Should we add this entity, etc. And so all that to say, like, the short answer is yes, we of course do update it and change it. I will say it's constantly a little bit of a kind of push and pull, because the whole point of having the state agnostic schema is to figure out a way that you know, we can make things work and be able to compare across different states. Like, the state agnostic analyses we're able to do because we have this, you know, one way of looking at things are really, really powerful. And so we do have somewhat of a high threshold for when we would drastically change schema. One thing that's also important to note is, like, for example, we will hydrate all of the key entities within a state in the state agnostic way. And sometimes for a specific opportunity within a state, they'll need this random piece of information that doesn't, like, exist in our schema and shouldn't, like, it's not relevant for us to have. And so we do have an ability within our products and our analyses that our analysts can pull in raw data. So basically, I, as the implementation engineer, can get the raw data and put it into our system, and it will live in BigQuery as the raw data. And a data analyst can incorporate that downstream as something that's, like, viewable in a product for whatever reason, or something that's used as a certain dimension within an analysis. We admittedly try not to do that as often as possible, because using raw data is kind of the whole reason we made this whole process. Is like, there's, you know, weird character, like, all this whole process ensures that we don't have weird characters and we don't have weird data anomalies, and we've actually done many different validation tests to go through it. But we do certainly have situations where we have to pull that in different ways and be creative about it. So the classic saying that my team would be, you know, making fun of me for bringing this up, because I literally always say it, is that the process of ingest is really an art, not a science. Like, it is very much weaving together in the most creative way we can things, the way that things move forward. And so we, you know, on a case-by-case basis, make judgment calls based on how things can work as cleanly as possible, but sometimes that just means we end up doing some things a little bit differently.
When you say normalize, do you have to go, are you talking about database normalization, first normal form, second normal form, or is this something that's less with the structure and relationship of data and more, this data has to look this particular way because XYZ rules are in existence.
Yeah, it's more of the second. It's more referring to specifically like the state table and the normalized state tables have the same structure, well, mostly the same structure. We do add a couple fields in normalization, but the overall structure is the same. And truly it is just more of what you're referring to in the second, which is just that there are certain rules. Like, for example, one of the things that we do in normalization is if we have a noted death date for someone, but the raw data indicates them being incarcerated after that, our normalization has a method that will truncate all periods as of the death date of someone. And so there's things like that it's basically just like certain rules we know have to be true in practice, like in real life, that because of the way that data is documented within states, it's just typically not, that's not necessarily a check that they're doing. They're not necessarily building in rules to their database that's requiring that. And so we build in certain things that make it so that we don't have strange data anomalies that would be discovered later on down our pipeline when we're surfacing individuals for opportunities and things like that. I do see a question here on, have states switched over to your database after seeing how data can be updated to newer software? Definitely not. So states are very excited about the work we can do and are always eager to learn about our platform and the process we're doing here. But for obvious reasons, we are able to do that because of our structure as an organization. Obviously, most of the states are using their state government databases, and it's a much bigger system. It's not necessarily only the DOC that's using these databases, it's every state agency. And so all that to say, I think in the long term, of course, government data wants to upgrade and update things, but it has to be by definition a slow process, and it should be because they are dealing with many other factors that we do not have to account for. But they are certainly excited when they see it and excited to know that this could be done. And transparently, depending on the state we're working with, certain states are further along in this kind of data transformation space than others. Certain states are, trying to upgrade everything to this and are automatically excited about this. Other states are like, we've got way other different things to worry about. And so we're not worried about updating our databases anytime soon. And so at some point in the future, I imagine all, state governments will need to address in some capacity updating to newer versions of things. But for now, we receive all of their data as read only. So like we aren't actually able to update or change anything in their specific systems. We basically are just visualizing things for them in a way that's much cleaner so that they can actually update it in their systems themselves. Any other questions?
I was curious sort of what the best or most memorable results that you've had so far have been.
We've had a lot of really incredible products and analyses that have been rolled out. It's hard to pick just one. For me in particular, I have worked pretty extensively on several tools related to automating the process for getting people on lower levels of supervision, whether that's through compliant reporting or through early, basically they have to fill out this note that gets them discharged. And previously it would take like months extra off of their months extra after they were eligible to fill out this note because it simply wasn't automated. And we've automated that form in a way that people literally get a notification the second that someone is eligible and then they can file that note. So I think things like that feel very much of a win because it is truly like processes and policies that are already on the books just being acted upon the way they actually can be acted upon, which is really incredible. We've also more recently gotten more involved in facility side work. And so bringing to light various different opportunities for someone to receive hearing reevaluation after they've been in restricted housing for a certain amount of time. And so we've done a lot of, UXR and research into ways in which perhaps restricted housing is not being used as a very effective tool within the facilities. And for me personally, that is really intriguing work, because it's something that has a really huge impact on someone's experience within the system. I am going to not say the number because I don't know the actual most accurate number today, but in particular for one of the states that we're working with, we launched a number of opportunities, and through all of the opportunities where we surfaced people that were eligible for downgrade or eligible for reduced supervision sentences or something like that, there's something like 20 to 30% of their entire supervision population is eligible for an opportunity. Like, it's a very high number. Don't quote me on that number. I don't know what it is today, but I think pointing that out is really impactful, because it's showing that what we're doing is difficult work, and working in criminal justice is difficult work. But the fact that we are just basically surfacing something that should exist already, or that could exist, I think is really encouraging, to show that there is so much opportunity for impact, and so much opportunity to really improve many different people's experience in the criminal justice system. So that is certainly what gets me up in the morning and excited to work on this, especially when there are certain days when I'm mad about delimiters or encodings or SQL queries, because the work is challenging, but it is certainly worth it, because we are able to have really direct impact on people's experience. Any other
Thank you.
questions?
Well, thank you to both Lily and Genevieve. Let me share my screen for the next the next little segment.